Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Hi, and welcome back to Agriculture in a Nutshell. This is Bill Brush, and we've been talking over the last several podcasts about fertility plans and different crops and more specifics to that. And in some future ones, I will be in more of that mode where we'll talk about the specific needs of different crops. But I wanted to go backwards just a little bit because I after reviewing all of our podcasts, I thought it was good to know, and this will work for anybody that is doing any kind of fertility program for your garden, for your crops, for your tree crops, for your row crops, for vegetative crops, for reproductive crops, anything that you might be growing. We're just going to go through a general plan and why the different nutrients and where they fit, and then what you need to consider when you are setting together your fertility plan.
Now Bill's going to get into talking a little bit about some of the more important nutrients that people commonly think of first whenever they think of farming, such as nitrogen.
Almost all the time, anybody's first nutrient that they always worry about, and I don't care at what level you are at, is nitrogen. And that's the big reason for that is it really is the key to growth. You know, it's necessary for the energy of cell division and energy for conversion. Basically, you've got to have that spark, that energy spark from nitrogen to do cell division. And how do you get a plant to grow? Well, that is cells being built upon cells, being built upon cells. And so what you need is you need to have an adequate amount so that the plant has the right amount of nitrogen when it needs it for certain functions. And that leads to, well, then what type of nitrogen? There's two forms of nitrogen, a nitrate nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen, and both are taken up by plants. There's other nitrogens out there, but they aren't taken up. Ammonium, NH3, you can have a urea, and there's some other nitrogen-based fertilizer. But these two are what the plant recognizes as what it needs for growth and reproduction. You know, the ammonium, the NH4, it is the reproductive form of nitrogen. In other words, that nitrogen that's needed for that plant to reproduce. The other nitrate is more vegetative, and it needs that for rapid cell division and growth of the plant and growth of all cells that once their reproductive capabilities, once we start with nitrogen, well, then we say, well, when do we apply it? We'll just take a crop. Say your crop is requiring 125 pounds of nitrogen. Well, one thing you don't do is just go out there and say, well, I need 125 pounds of nitrogen, and this is a 25% nitrogen material, so I'm going to put 500 pounds of that material on at one time and expect it to be efficient. It is very inefficient, and at the same time doesn't do you any good for the environment, because a lot of that nitrogen, once it's converted to nitrate, will leach through and the plant won't be able to take it all up. And there's a certain amount of nitrogen at super high levels like that. It also becomes toxic, and so we want to make sure that we spread out our applications. There's a lot of people talk about nitrogen applications as being spoon-fed, meaning a little bit all the time. And it's a great way to apply nitrogen. But then we have to go back to the reality of what you have as capability of how many opportunities you have to actually apply nitrogen. There's a lot of fields that once you get the crop planted, it may be at such a height that I can't get in to fertilize it like I did before. And so therefore, I better have had it all on because I don't have another opportunity to get any more on. So there's other opportunities. Your irrigation system, it limits you to how you can put it on or when you can put it on. And so we just need to separate your nitrogen out into functions. The maximum I ever like to apply is somewhere around 50 pounds of nitrogen, actual N, applied at any one time. If I could break that up into two 25-pound applications of nitrogen, that would be better. But the other thing that we need to also look at is what time of the year are you? Is there a lot of rainfall coming? Or is there a lot of irrigation taking place early in the season? Because if you are, ammonium, which is not as leachable as the nitrate is, it's good to get applied earlier. One of the products I truly love, and I use it in a lot of crops at a lot of different times, is ammonium sulfate, because sulfate is really an underutilized nutrient, and it's one thing that people forget. Everybody understands nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. Those are the big three, NP and K. You see it on all your fertilizer bags or all your fertilizer equipment that they send out to have you apply it in your field. All of those have that NPK on there. Sulfur is the fourth most important nutrient in terms of what the plant needs in pound-wise to get it to perform properly. And one of the reasons we tend to forget about it, it is not what we call a cation, it's an anion, which means it's negatively charged and is not held within the soil. It moves through the soil profile. So as you irrigate, you are losing some of that sulfate. It's an SO4 if you look at oxidated form of sulfur, and it will leach through the profile. So over time, all of a sudden, you can be deficient in sulfur, and you may have applied it, but it's not there anymore. So again, sulfur, like nitrogen, because nitrogen will basically also oxidize and go from ammonium to nitrate nitrogen. And because they're both leachable, that's why we need to continue to apply them over time. And this leads back to spoon feeding. But if you start a season with an ammonium sulfate, you have a nitrogen that won't leach and a soil that probably is deficient in sulfur right off the get-go. The sandier you are, the more likely it is to be devoid of sulfur, because that sulfate sulfur will leach between those large particle size in a sandy soil. So hopefully you've heard some of my previous podcasts when we talk about soil structure and what we're looking for, a difference in sand and clay.
The next nutrient that Bill's going to be talking about is phosphorus.
The next I want to back up a little bit and go to the P in that NPK, which is phosphorus. And it's a really misunderstood nutrient in that we understand because of where it falls in the formulas, the NPK, S, and calcium, magnesium, and the list that how they're listed on a fertilizer bag, etc., tends to also show what importance or how much is really needed by that plant. Well, P's number 2, but a lot of people, particularly in the ag business, do not apply enough P because they're going by two things. One, the leaf sample numbers that they get from their foliar testing, and they also look at the removal rates of phosphate. And those two things together don't paint a true picture of what phosphate is needed, because phosphate will limit your size of your leaf surface. It'll also limit the growth of the roots if it can't get into enough phosphate. And it will slow the plant down and ultimately slow down production. And if you're growing a vegetative crop, you're going to have a lot less mass. If you're growing a reproductive crop, you're going to have a lot less of whatever it is you're growing, because it is slowing down, because it needs phosphate to run not only photosynthesis but respiration. There are some components that are phosphate that need to be available and enough supply for it to maximize the breakdown of all the glucose that photosynthesis is producing, which is what plants basically do. They're sugar manufacturers. They manufacture glucose through photosynthesis, and that glucose needs to be converted to calories, and that's a huge function of phosphate. But that's not really told to you, because when you do your tissue test, you say, well, why aren't I short of phosphate if I really needed more? Because you will be limited by how much the plant can take up, and therefore it puts that percentage into all the leaf surfaces so that it can do photosynthesis and respiration within all those cells. So therefore, one that is short of phosphate will have just almost identical percentage, the one that has adequate or an enormous amount. So anyway, phosphate, always important. It's the key to any good start on a crop is get into early phosphate.
Next up, Bill's going to be touching on potassium and revisiting its importance.
Now we have potassium, which is really important for many, many functions, almost too many to go over in a little time. So I try to break them down into a few real bullet points that you can remember and go back to and refer to. One of the most important parts of phosphate, it's a huge stress reliever. If you have adequate amounts of potassium into your plant, it will really help when you have heat stress or stress of not enough water, or in some cases too much water. Because one of the things is that potassium's key to the transpiration, or the basically losing water through the stomatas in the leaves and basically cooling itself, but then also pulling in, releasing oxygen, but pulling in water vapor at night and all kinds of things. And those guard cells that control that, of closing those stomatas and opening them, is a function where potassium really sets into those guard cells and makes them work properly. They also are really important to the maturation and finishing a crop off. You want your peaches to finish off properly, or your nut crops to finish off properly. It really is a function of potassium as you get to the end. And the other thing it gives you is more cell wall strength in those. So you get in your maturations of, say, your stone fruits, your apricots, your peaches, your nectarines, they become firmer. Their cells have more potassium, and they're able to have longer shelf life and still have plenty of good taste and flavor, and also last for longer after they've been picked and maybe shipped. So potassium becomes a real important stress reliever, and maturing your crop on time and filling up those cells so that they weigh more if you're getting paid for it. They also are key to cell wall strength. So if you're growing anything that has a stalk or anything that has a limb, you really need a strong cell wall, and potassium really will build that up. And so you have to have adequate amounts to do all these other functions and still have enough to make those cells strong so that they can hold the extra weight that you're going to apply through the crop, and through the weight of water, and through the weight of the foliage that it's putting on.
Next up is the cation twins, calcium and magnesium.
Then you have calcium and magnesium. Calcium basically fills all those cells that nitrogen develops, and then glues those cells together so that you can put cells on and build on top of it. That simple cell division of 1 to 2, one cell becoming 2 cells, and 2 cells becoming 4, 4 becoming 8. And so the cell division becomes rapid. So you need a lot of calcium to fill all those cells and expand it at a normal rate. And so when you look at the tips of growing plants, you'll notice they're limber because they have been glued together and built rapidly through nitrogen and calcium, but they don't have enough cell structure because we don't have enough potassium there yet. And you can really notice it if you check your tips and see how limber they are. The more limber they are, the less potassium you have. And over time, you'll see that they'll firm up. And that means the potassium is getting there, and it'll go out clear to the end as we mature that crop again. Calcium also improves nutrient uptake. Dr. Albrecht, who I've read a lot and talked a lot about on my podcast, talked about all the nutrients do better in the presence of calcium. It isn't they go in with calcium, as Dr. Albrecht put it. He says they comes over the back of calcium, meaning it's like opening the gate and then allowing all other nutrients to flow into that plant, and makes the uptake of them easier and more efficient. And we have another one, it's twin partner in magnesium. There's so much fighting for soil structure that it is always one, but its functions are very, very defined. If you go back to soil samples, something in what we call the base saturation, I recommend you go back and listen to those podcasts again if you're not familiar with what I might be talking about. Somewhere between 10 and 13% of base saturation on most soils is the perfect spot for it. If you go to much lower than that, you will not have enough magnesium to do things that magnesium does. If it goes up more than that, it doesn't like to be taken up at higher levels. So too low isn't good, too high is not too good. And as you get higher and higher, you work on poor cell poor porosity in your soil and poor soil structure. And so therefore, you want to get these back in balance. A good average balance is somewhere between 10 and 15 to 18% magnesium, higher on those sandy soils, lower on those heavier soils, and calcium somewhere between 65% up to about 70%. Those are the kind of the sweet spots for both of those nutrients. Okay. After we get those, I should go back one thing I almost forgot. Magnesium is so important, and it's very mobile. If you put foliars on a magnesium, they're very mobile. And one of the reasons they're so mobile is that the magnesium ion is the center of the chlorophyll molecule. And chlorophyll, as you know, is that energy-seeking portion of that plant that helps that photosynthetic reaction, which is essential for that plant's energy for it to grow, thrive, and basically produce the crop that it was intended to do. So magnesium, extremely important. It's very important for, obviously, because of that in photosynthesis. And also does a lot of these nutrients produce other enzymes that are particularly essential for other functions of these plants. So many of them, I can't really do them justice in a short period of time, but just be advised that magnesium, think about it as that center of that chlorophyll molecule, and you'll understand how really important it is, and how a lot of times we look at yellow as lack of nitrogen. A lot of times it can be not enough magnesium to produce the chlorophyll, or not enough of sulfur for other reasons. Anyway.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about the 5 basic micronutrients.
Next will be the basic 5 micronutrients. And I'll talk a little bit about boron. A little's good and a lot's bad, but it has so many things, particularly for seeded crops, for pollination. It makes pollination, it's essential for pollination, the elongation of the tubules that you have, and that allows the function of that ovule getting fertilized, and so therefore you are growing, seeds on every one of those. Could be nut crops that are the seed, could be corn kernels, it could be beans, it could be any of those, but they're essential for all of those. It also helps translocate starch and sugars from the leaves into your finished nut or grain crop. But again, a little's good, a lot's bad. And you're only going to know the right amounts with a good, accurate soil test. Next, we have iron, and iron is essential for that beautiful dark green color that we like our plants to look like. Everything looks healthier when it has enough iron. We need to always make sure that we have proper amount of iron, because it works in an antagonistic state with manganese, which is also essential. But that manganese, if it gets to be at a higher level than the iron, it will take that iron and oxidize it, and basically a good way to look at iron oxide is a rust, but it basically is tying up the iron, and so the iron's not then available to the plant for the plant functions. But if you do a leaf test, you'll find that iron will be heavy, or it'll be high enough and you don't think you have an iron deficiency, but you have a manganese creating it. But next is in those 5 micronutrients is manganese. And I love manganese because it is such an overlooked micronutrient. In my consulting, I've always said if I need boron or iron or I need zinc, and even sometimes copper, everybody says okay. But if I say your plants really need manganese, it's always why. Why? Nobody ever told me this. And it's another one that's really overlooked. And manganese particularly, it's the key to set. If you need to set a crop, if you need to set nuts on your trees, if you need to set corn kernels, if you need to set anything that's a seed producer, manganese is essential. It also is necessary in making crops stand up, because if you don't have an adequate amount of manganese, you cannot form lignin. And lignin will give you a support of those cells and make them firm so that they can support crops. And so manganese has other functions. Those are the 2 I want to drive home today. Next is copper. And copper is like nature's fungicide. It has natural, fungicidal properties. And so when you get your crop higher enough in copper, what it actually does then is actually has a lot of resistance to other fungal disease that might attack your leaf surface. It also gives your plants resilience, meaning when it gets too hot and everything starts to droop, if you have the wrong amount of copper or not enough, it will basically droop, and sometimes it will break. But with copper, it may sag in the afternoons, and then in the morning you'll see it pull back up. It gives those cells, all of them, resilience to be able to handle the stresses. And like I said, also, it's really important for you get free fungicidal properties, and it seems to keep healthier plants. It improves plant health just by what it's able to prevent, and also you might allow you not to have to spray certain products to take care of fungal diseases because it's naturally occurring by itself. And the last nutrient I'm going to talk about is zinc. And everybody thinks, for whatever reason, if I tell you don't, they must have seen a zinc deficiency of one time, which is a really ugly, what we call interveinal chlorosis, really striped. It's going in dark green down the stripe, but not yellow in between those. And so what it is the veins, the zinc will take the nutrients to the vein, but if you're short, it will not translocate it between veins. And so what you get is this green-yellow striped activity. So everybody's seen that. So if I say you need zinc, and I've consulted, or anybody, they say, well, I probably do, and they put it in. But a good other thing that you'll see as a real zinc deficiency is what we call rosetting, which basically the ends of the crop will come out and they'll be stunted, and they grow like a flower, like a petal, and they're all the petals are all pushed together, and you have zinc. And by that time, you're really too late in the game. So again, find out what you have with zinc in your soil test, and then, because it's the key to the distribution of all nutrients, it helps them move through that and pass out through all of those cell wall tissues and get it into all the tissues. Therefore, it really is an important nutrient. It needs to be balanced with phosphate. High phosphate demands high zinc. Low phosphates demands a lot lower level of zinc, but always an adequate number so that we can keep enough into the plant. Too much phosphate will block zinc if it's low. Too much zinc will block phosphate if it's too low. So that's kind of how you put together all these nutrients and why you put it into a general overall fertility plan. And now, once we talk about this today, and this will pretty much wrap up today's podcast, I want you to go back and listen to some of those things on soil tests and other things that we talked about, maybe in nutrient that didn't make as much sense to you. We have those all back on some individual podcasts. And do a little bit more back. You might make more sense to you after you listen to today's. So this is it for today. Thanks.
Thank you very much for another absolutely wonderful episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure that everyone loved what you had to hear about recapping on the various nutrients needed for a successful farm and crop. Make sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and always stay curious.